It was supposed to be a joyful celebration. I had traveled to Iowa, excited to surprise my little brother for his graduation. The plan was perfect, a surprise party at a charming Airbnb we had rented for the occasion. Everything felt right, and as the family gathered, the energy in the house was lively and warm. But things took a strange turn when my other brother and I went to the basement to grab an extra table. As soon as we stepped down those creaky stairs, a chill crawled up my spine. We locked eyes, and without saying much, we both knew we didn't want to be down there for long. The basement felt heavy, like the air was thicker, and the longer we stayed, the more unsettling it became. I tried to shake off the strange feeling. After all, it was just a basement, right? We grabbed the table and made our way back upstairs, joking about how ridiculous it was to feel spooked by such a normal space. The party kicked off in full swing. Laughter filled the rooms, and the house felt alive. For a while, the unease I had felt downstairs faded into the background. But every now and then, I found myself glancing at the basement door, as if expecting something or someone to come out. As the party continued, my girlfriend decided to run a load of laundry. She started toward the basement, but stopped halfway and looked back at me. "It's too creepy down there. Can you come with me?" she asked. I could see she wasn't joking, so I agreed, even though the last thing I wanted was to go back into that basement. We went down together, moving quickly to avoid the strange feeling creeping in again. The air felt colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch. We loaded the washer, and I rushed us back upstairs, relieved to leave the basement behind. But something about that place clung to me, like it didn't want us to go. I told myself it was just my imagination. Yet, the way my girlfriend kept glancing toward the basement stairs told me she felt it too. We tried to shake it off and went back to the party, hoping the weird feeling would go away. But deep down, we both knew something wasn't right. As the party wound down, the guests slowly headed out, leaving just me and my girlfriend alone in the house. We sat together, trying to unwind after the long day. Everything seemed peaceful for a moment until the buzzer from the laundry room suddenly went off. She gave me a confused look. "I didn't grab the clothes earlier," she said, her voice uneasy. Hours had passed since we loaded the washer, so why hadn't it buzzed before? We both knew it felt off, but we went back down to the basement anyway to get the laundry. At the stairs, she hesitated again, and I couldn't blame her. The basement felt heavier this time, like the air had thickened with something unseen. I hurried down the steps, grabbed the laundry, and dashed back up as fast as I could. After that, we decided to lock every door and window in the house. It had become a habit whenever we stayed somewhere unfamiliar, but this time it felt like more than a routine. It felt like a warning, as if we weren't alone in that house. There was only one door left to lock, the back door by the kitchen, right next to the basement stairs. I stepped toward it, and that strange, heavy feeling returned. My back was to the basement as I turned the lock, and every nerve in my body told me not to look behind me. But I forced myself to stay calm and finish the job. The house felt different now. We tried to brush it off as exhaustion, but even the simple things became unsettling. To get to our room, we had to turn on a light switch at the bottom of the stairs before climbing up. The stairs were steep, and the room itself felt strange, like it wasn't meant to be a bedroom, maybe an attic that had been converted. Just as I flicked the light switch, we heard a loud banging noise from the kitchen, fast and sharp, like metal clanging. My heart jumped. My girlfriend's face turned pale, and I knew mine looked the same. I started toward the kitchen, but the noise came again, loud and relentless. Every hair on my neck stood on end, and it felt like the house was trying to tell us something. I reached the kitchen, my heart pounding. The noise was louder now, echoing through the walls. I looked around, expecting to find something or someone causing it, but there was nothing. Then I noticed it. At the top of the stairs leading to the attic room, the ceiling fan was spinning wildly, hitting its pole with a rhythmic, unsettling clatter. I raced upstairs and turned off the fan, but the unease didn't go away. My girlfriend stayed close, her fear mirroring mine. We didn't speak about it, but the air felt heavy, as if the house was breathing around us. Something wasn't adding up. Fans don't just turn on by themselves, and they definitely don't go full speed out of nowhere. Trying to stay calm, we prepared for bed, but the silence that followed was worse than the noise. It felt like the house was waiting, watching, ready for its next move. We finally got into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The room was hot and uncomfortable, making it hard to relax. When I did drift off, strange dreams took over. I kept seeing a shadowy figure standing out on the lawn, motionless, watching the house. It felt too real, and every time I woke up, I expected to see it outside the window. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I got out of bed, exhausted from the restless night. As I made my way downstairs to start the day, something strange pulled my attention back to the basement stairs. I stood there, staring down into the dark. It was as if the basement was calling me, silently urging me to come closer. I fought the urge and forced myself back to the kitchen, where my girlfriend was already packing up. I told myself it was over just a bad night in an old house. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something was still lurking in that basement, and it wasn't finished with us yet. With everything packed, we did one last walk through to make sure nothing was left behind. I went into the kitchen to check, ready to finally leave this unsettling place behind. Just as I turned to call it clear, the sound I dreaded most echoed through the house, the sharp buzz of the laundry machine. We stood frozen for a moment, the noise cutting through the silence like a warning. My girlfriend's eyes widened, and without a word, we knew it was time to go. I grabbed the bags and told her to start the car. As she rushed outside, the house gave us one final parting shot. The ceiling fan upstairs roared back to life, slamming against its pole again and again. I didn't wait to investigate. I ran out the door, heart racing, and jumped into the car. My girlfriend took one look at me and knew. "The fan," she whispered, and I nodded. I slammed the car into gear, and we drove off without looking back. We sped away from the house, not saying a word until we reached a diner down the road. Sitting there in the safety of bright lights and the buzz of strangers, we finally let out the breath we'd been holding. My hands were still shaking as I texted the Airbnb host, mentioning the strange noises from the washer and the fan that wouldn't stay off. Even as we tried to calm down, the whole experience gnawed at us. It wasn't just a faulty machine or a fan with a mind of its own. Something else had been in that house. Something we couldn't see, but definitely felt. As we sipped our coffee, I couldn't help but glance out the diner window, half expecting to see that shadowy figure from my dream standing in the distance. It was over or so, I told myself. But even miles away, the unsettling feeling stayed with me, as if the house wasn't quite ready to let us go. The cold October air greeted us as we pulled up to the old farmhouse, its tall frame standing quietly against the dark sky. The road leading here had been lonely, winding through empty fields, with no sign of life for miles. The host had left the lights on inside, casting a warm glow from the windows, making the place look inviting at first glance. My partner, Sarah, gave my hand a reassuring squeeze as we unloaded our bags from the car. Our dog, Max, sniffed around the unfamiliar ground, his tail wagging just a little, but I could tell he was unsure. The house looked charming in an old-fashioned way, with its creaky wooden porch and faded paint. It had a strange stillness to it, like a place that carried old memories. We walked inside, hoping this would be a peaceful escape from the noise of the city. The warmth from the lights made the farmhouse feel cozy at first, but as I shut the door behind us, the silence seemed to close in. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you should whisper, even when no one else is around. Max trotted inside, his paws tapping lightly on the wooden floor, but I noticed something strange. He wasn't his usual curious self. He sniffed cautiously, ears pinned back, and stuck close to us as we walked through the house. The creaky floors, which had seemed charming at first, now added an odd tension with every step we took. Sarah lit a few candles while I explored the kitchen. It was fully stocked, but somehow it still felt off. There was nothing visibly wrong, but the air felt dense, almost as if it was pressing down on us. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on being tired from the long drive. But then I heard its soft, deliberate footsteps outside the bedroom door. I rushed to check, but no one was there. Sarah told me it was probably the old house settling, but the uneasy feeling stayed. Max whined quietly, staring toward the dark hallway, as if he sensed something we couldn't see. That night, I realized this place wasn't just old, it was watching us. The next morning, Sarah brushed off the strange noises from the night before, convincing me it was nothing to worry about. I tried to believe her, but the feeling that something was off stayed with me. We decided to explore the countryside, hoping a walk would clear my head and help us enjoy the trip. The landscape was beautiful, with rolling hills and bright autumn leaves painting the scenery. But even out in the open, I couldn't shake the sense of being followed. It wasn't just in my mind. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I felt it. Like invisible eyes were locked on us, waiting for us to drop our guard. Sarah chatted as we walked, oblivious to my unease. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but the further we went, the more certain I became that something or someone was watching. And whatever it was, it had no intention of letting us feel safe. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the farmhouse's charm began to fade. The air felt heavier, and the quiet inside the house grew unsettling. Sarah and I were sitting in the living room when the lights flickered without warning. For a moment, we exchanged nervous glances, but she shrugged it off. "Probably just a power surge," she said. But then, the lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone to turn on the flashlight. The sudden silence felt thicker, as if the house itself was holding its breath. We made our way to the fuse box, hoping the issue was minor. When I flipped the switches, the lights flickered back on, but something was different. The air felt colder, heavier, like we weren't the only ones inside that house anymore. Even with the lights back on, the feeling in the house had shifted. It was subtle but impossible to ignore, like the walls were closing in. As we climbed into bed that night, the tension in the air wrapped around me, making it hard to relax. No matter how tightly I pulled the blanket over me, the chill lingered. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Then, out of nowhere, a cold breeze swept through the room. Even though the windows were shut tight, my skin prickled as if something unseen had brushed past me. I sat up, my heart pounding, when I heard it faint whispers, low and constant, coming from the corner of the room. I woke Sarah in a panic, but by the time she sat up, the whispers were gone. She told me it was just my imagination, but I knew what I had heard. Something was there with us, hiding just out of sight, and it wasn't going away. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining things. The unease only grew as the strange events kept happening. Objects we left in one spot would show up in another, and the temperature in the room would shift without reason from freezing cold one moment to stifling hot the next. Late that night, as Sarah slept beside me, I sat up, too restless to lie still. That's when I saw her, a faint, shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the dim light. She wasn't solid, more like mist, but there was no mistaking her shape. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe for a moment. I whispered Sarah's name and shook her awake, my voice trembling. But the moment she opened her eyes, the figure vanished. Sarah looked around the room, confused, but there was nothing there. She told me it had to be a trick of the light, but I knew what I had seen. The figure wasn't just a shadow, it was someone, or something, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the strange events, the cold air, it was all too much. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and decided to face whatever was in that house. Sarah was asleep, so I spoke quietly into the darkness, my voice barely above a whisper. If someone's here, show yourself. We don't mean any harm. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the room grew colder, so cold I could see my breath in the air. A thin mist formed in front of me, slowly swirling until it took the shape of a woman. She looked sad, her features blurry, like a memory fading away. There was a deep sorrow in her eyes that sent chills through me. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. What do you want? The figure hesitated, as if unsure how to answer. Finally, in a voice that sounded like wind rustling through leaves, she whispered, I am trapped, alone and forgotten. My heart ached for her. Whatever had happened, she didn't belong here, stuck in this cold, lonely place. I knew then that we couldn't leave until we helped her. The next morning, Sarah and I searched for answers. We dug through old records, newspaper clippings, and anything we could find about the farmhouse's past. Slowly, the pieces came together. A young bride had once lived here, her life tragically cut short by an accident. Her spirit had been trapped ever since, unable to move on. We knew what we had to do. That evening, we performed a ritual we had found, hoping it would help her find peace. The words felt strange on my tongue, but as we spoke them, the air in the room shifted. A sense of release washed over me, like a weight I hadn't noticed before had finally lifted. The misty figure appeared one last time, her features softer now, almost peaceful. She gave a faint, grateful smile before dissolving into the air, leaving behind only stillness. For the first time since we arrived, the house felt warm. The oppressive heaviness was gone. We packed our things the next day, ready to leave the farmhouse behind. But as we drove away, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had stayed here, never knowing the sadness that haunted these walls. And I hoped, with quiet relief, that no one would ever have to face it again. The excitement was hard to contain as we arrived in Supakan. Our vacation had finally begun, and the villa we rented felt like the perfect getaway. It was everything we imagined: spacious, beautifully decorated, and perched on the hills with a breathtaking view of the French Riviera. The sunlight danced on the swimming pool, and the fresh sea breeze hinted at carefree days ahead. We spent the first few days exploring the city, indulging in French food and enjoying the warm Mediterranean sun. The kids were over the moon, splashing in the pool, while my spouse and I soaked in the peace and beauty around us. For a while, everything felt perfect, as if nothing could go wrong. But as the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, the villa seemed to change. The cheerful energy of the day faded, and a strange heaviness settled over the place. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things, like the way the shadows stretched a bit too far across the windows. We brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just the unfamiliarity of being in a new place. After all, what could possibly go wrong in such a beautiful setting? It started small. Late at night, we began hearing strange noises, soft taps and creaks that seemed to come from the walls. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling or the wind outside. But then, the shadows outside the windows seemed to move, shifting like someone or something was walking past. We tried to ignore it, thinking it was just our minds playing tricks after a long day. But the feeling lingered, heavy and unsettling, as if we weren't really alone in the villa. Every time I glanced toward the windows, it felt like something was watching us from the dark. It wasn't enough to scare us, not yet. But those quiet, strange moments left a knot in my stomach. And as each night grew darker, the sense that something was wrong grew harder to ignore. One evening, while the kids were getting ready for bed, I decided to step outside for some air. The villa's garden path was dimly lit, and the night felt unusually quiet. As I walked, a strange sensation crawled over me, the feeling of being watched. I stopped and looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Just as I was about to turn back toward the villa, I saw him. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. There was no mistaking the danger in his presence. He was no lost tourist. In that moment, I knew. This man wasn't just passing by, he was a criminal, the kind you read about in the news. Before I could react, he took a step toward me, his intentions clear. My heart pounded as I managed to dodge his advance and sprint back toward the safety of the villa. Every instinct told me that this night was far from over. I slammed the villa door behind me, locking it with shaky hands. My heart raced as I rushed to check the windows, making sure every latch was secure. I told my spouse what I saw, and her face paled with fear. We quickly got the kids from their room, gathering them close as we locked every door and window we could find. The villa, which had felt like a peaceful retreat, now felt like a fragile barrier between us and the danger outside. We huddled together in the living room, trying to stay calm. But then, faint footsteps echoed from outside, circling the house. The sound of whispered threats followed, low and menacing, sending chills through us. Every creak of the floor and rustle outside made my pulse quicken. We knew the locks wouldn't hold forever if he tried to get in. All we could do now was wait and hope that the night would pass without him finding a way inside. The night dragged on, every second stretching into eternity. We sat in silence, listening to the faint sounds of footsteps moving around the villa. The whispers would come and go, sometimes right by the windows, other times fading into the night. Every noise sent a fresh wave of fear through us. None of us could sleep, not even for a moment. The kids clung to us, too scared to close their eyes. My spouse and I sat by the front door, holding our breath at every little sound, ready for the worst. The darkness outside felt endless, and all we could do was wait, trapped by fear and uncertainty. Just when it felt like we couldn't take it anymore, the footsteps stopped. A deep, unsettling silence fell over the villa, more terrifying than the noises had been. We didn't dare move, afraid that any sound might draw him back. When the first light of morning crept through the curtains, we felt a wave of relief. The long, terrifying night was finally over. The kids dozed off on the couch, exhaustion catching up with them, and my spouse and I exchanged tired glances, grateful to have made it through. For the first time in hours, It felt like we could breathe again. We stepped outside, hoping the danger had passed. But as I scanned the garden, my heart sank. There, hidden in the dense bushes just beyond the villa, I saw him, the same figure from the night before. He wasn't gone. He had been waiting, biding his time. I knew then that we weren't safe yet. The nightmare hadn't ended, it was still lurking, just out of reach. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and called the police. Every second felt like an eternity as I pleaded with the operator, urging them to send help fast. The sound of sirens in the distance finally broke the silence, giving us a glimmer of hope. Before long, police cars sped up the winding roads, their flashing lights cutting through the morning haze. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, and began searching the villa's grounds. My heart pounded as we waited, hoping they would find the man before he slipped away. Minutes felt like hours as we listened to the officers comb through the dense bushes. And then, just when I thought he might escape, they found him crouched in the shadows, his eyes wide with fear. The police dragged him out, cuffing his hands behind his back. And with that, the nightmare was finally over. We watched from inside the villa as the officers led the man away in handcuffs. Relief washed over us, but it was mixed with lingering fear. Even though the danger was gone, the memory of the night still clung to us. None of us spoke for a moment, as if words would break the fragile peace that had just returned. In the following hours, we packed our things, eager to leave the villa and put this nightmare behind us. But as we closed the door for the last time, I couldn't help but glance back. The villa stood quiet and beautiful under the morning sun, a stark contrast to the terror we had lived through. As we drove away, I realized how easily the beauty of a place can hide its darkness. Even in the most perfect settings, you never know what might be waiting in the shadows. And no matter how far we traveled, the memory of that night would stay with us, etched in our minds forever.